Okay, so let's start our last video on the tensions debates within socialism. They agree on some stuff, but they disagree on lots of stuff, like the extent of equality, the route to capitalism, all of that stuff. But let's have a little look about what they agree on. Okay, so first of all, socialists agree that human nature is malleable and tends to be positive. Okay, so the degree to which they think this changes, but they agree that that it can be changed by circumstances. So if you encourage cooperation, then that flourishes. But they tend to believe that human nature is positive. Secondly, they're all concerned with social justice. Okay, so this is essentially the idea of fairness. Now they get to this concept of social justice through different means. Some socialists think it's okay to have equality of opportunity and stuff like that, but they also all agree that we are born into the world, no one's any better than the next person, and that we should have some kind of social justice. Following on from this, they all agree they all sort of support the notion of equality in some way. As we know, they support different notions of equality. And lastly, they're all really happy to use state intervention to some extent. Okay, so you won't get any socialists going, well, we're not going to have any state. We're gonna have a night watchman state or less. So they're all happy to use that. But how are they different? Okay, so revolutionary socialism. Let's start with this. So you've got to remember that this started during the Industrial Revolution. So and also at a time when workers had no political power. So not only does the Industrial Revolution disenfranchise lots of people, so lots of people move from the land to the cities. They start to work in conditions that are absolutely atrocious. They start to get paid very little money. But they also don't have the right to vote because they don't have enough money. So you can see why people would feel powerless and want to get together, because obviously there's also lots and lots of them. Okay. Also, I'm going to put a little slide on for this one. Okay, so class interests were fundamentally opposed. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that the bourgeoisie will always they own the means of production, and they will always want to make the most profit possible. And how do you make the most profit possible? Well, you pay the least wages possible. Okay, those people who work for wages will always want the most wages possible because they want the most money possible. Therefore, the classes were fundamentally opposed. Now, not only this, but Marx thought that they would drift apart as well, because you would get richer and richer capitalists and poorer workers. So it would start off looking like that top picture with the big fish eating all the little fish, and then all the little fish get together and eat the big fish. So that's what he thought, that process was inevitable. Okay. Next one is that the state is an instrument of the bourgeoisie. So laws, it pretends to be neutral, but revolutionaries like Marx said, actually it's an instrument of the bourgeoisie, and it needs to be smashed, because if people start to rise up, then the state will react and crush revolutions, and will act in the interests of capital and money, etc., etc. Last one is capitalism as a system was inherently exploitative. That's kind of for the reasons I've just explained above, and it needed to be replaced. Once you had absolute equality, the kind of need for control of people over people would be removed. There would be no more classes, there would be no more conflict, and people would live in this kind of amazing utopia that Marx thought of as communism. And he even said, actually, once that's properly achieved, you don't need a state. But obviously, we've never seen that in the real world. Okay, let's go on. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you the thinkers as I do the branches of socialism. So let's have a look at Marx first. Okay, so Marx, I haven't put the date there, but he was working, well, his life was about 1820 to 1895, so right in the thick of the Industrial Revolution. What do you think? Okay, so in the Communist Manifesto, which is very small, and Capital, which is very big, he argues the following. Okay, so social class is fundamental to socialism. So social class is defined by your ownership or not of the means of production, and he says, for the reasons I outlined earlier, those class interests, he thinks that you are defined by your class class. Classes will reach working class will reach class consciousness, i.e. they will realize what's happening to them and go, oh, wait, that's not fair. You're not paying us enough, and they will have a revolution. Okay. He also argued that human nature is inherently social and can only be truly expressed under communism. So for Marx, he has this thing called a historical dialectic, and he said for all of human history, since we settled into agricultural settlements, we've always had higher classes and lower classes, and we might have called them slaves or priests or whatever, but it's always happened like that. So he says actually that's created a fundamental tension which has pushed history forward, and eventually we will reach communism, where we don't need to move forward anymore, because actually our human nature is inherently social, and we will be cooperating, and everything will be beautiful under communism. That's what he thought. He says, for this same reason, what I've just argued, he says revolution is inevitable for those same reasons I just mentioned now and on the previous slide, where we have a dialectic. A dialectic is when two forces oppose each other and then push a new thing into existence, okay, through their fight or their revolution or the tension there. Okay, so think of that like a oh, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example here. Yeah, so he basically says the classes clash, and in that clash there will be history is made, and you will get a new sort of form of history. Okay, so how do we use Marx? Well, if you ask me, in pretty much any essay on socialism, you really have to use Marx. Okay, he was a founder of socialism. His thoughts inspired revolutionaries across the globe through the 19th and 20th century. Still today, now he's a very influential thinker. People believe that once private property, he believed that only once private property was abolished would humans be truly free. He was a fierce critic of capitalism, but argued its demise was inevitable. If you were studying this at university level, I would say he actually also argued that capitalism was a necessary stage in history, but we can park that for a minute. And should any he should feature. Okay, so he should feature in any question. We're going to deal with another feature for revolutionary socialism. That's Rosa Luxemburg, Mr. Brackett there. But okay, so she comes a bit later. So what does she have to tell us that's extra here? So she writes a book called On Reform or Revolution. She argues that actually the evolutionary socialism, which we're going to look at in a minute, from thinkers like Beatrice Webb, was doomed as capitalism is inherently exploitative. So she said, she argued very fiercely that you could not have gradual socialism. She said that the state was too much in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and she said that the system of capitalism was too exploitative, and if you left it, it would kind of spread again, almost like a disease or something. So she would say no, you absolutely have to have a complete revolution. She said the struggle was necessary by a class-conscious proletariat was necessary. So she says that once the proletariat is class-conscious, they will overthrow the capitalist state. And she also recognize capitalism as an international system, so i.e. a bit like we see now. So we're like, oh no, capitalism isn't like that at all, because we're all rich and we all consume things and stuff like that in the UK. Well, actually, if you look at capitalism as an international system, what it does is it pushes exploitation out. So we consume things, very cheap things made in very awful conditions from all around the world, and she recognized that very early on, in the early sort of 19th century. And she also came into conflict with Lenin, saying that you couldn't give too much power to a sort of vanguard of proletariat. So Lenin had this group of working class people, and they would run things, and she said no, that's really dangerous, because they'll have too much power, which they did. Okay, how do we use her? Well, she was good for any question on the route to socialism, because she directly responds to this idea of evolutionary socialism. She says it's nonsense. You cannot have slow gradual route to socialism, and she completely rejects any trace of capitalism. So you can use her for that as well. So this idea of a mixed economy or whatever, she would completely reject that. Okay, she would completely reject that. Okay, so let's move on to the next branch, what we call social democracy, also called revisionism, also called social democrats, etc., etc., mixed economy, yada yada yada. Okay, so the clue is in the little image that I've used. It's basically socialism by the ballot box and a less extreme form as well. Okay. So, what do they believe? Socialism and socialist policies were achievable through the ballot box. Evolutionary, not revolutionary, i.e., it will happen slowly, gradually over the time, like evolution rather than a big bang. Capitalism is good at wealth creation, but it needs to be tamed, and its worst excesses needs to be managed. Okay, so they recognise that basically, actually, capitalism is quite good, isn't it? It makes us all richer. It generates lots of wealth for the country. It generates innovation, stuff like that. But it also, they argue, creates big inequality. So that needs to be, the state needs to be used in order to change that. Okay, so they prescribed a mixed economy, Keynesianism, which is, when the government gets involved in the economy with heavy regulation and trade union input. So what this means is actually there will you'll have an economy, but essentially trade unions will have a kind of seat at the table, if you like, with government, and they will talk, they will be negotiated with and not be left out of the kind of political body, if you like. The classic example of this time is the post-war consensus and the Attlee government, which obviously has huge taxation. So this is the period after the war where we have a booming economy for some decades, but the government's heavily involved in the economy. There's lots of nationalised industry. Trade unions is very strong, so they have when companies make a profit, the trade unions demand some of that profit, and they get it, and then that gives them money to give their members money to spend, and it's good for the economy, etc., etc. And all those welfare, NHS stuff that the Attlee government did as well. Okay, they accept. Social Democrats accept a degree of inequality, but focused on equality of outcome. Now, be careful not to get confused here, because what they mean by that is they think that things should be fair in the end of someone, not at the end of someone's life, as in their death, but they should have fairer outcomes. Not completely fair, not absolute equality, but fairer outcomes. And that's why they had that very high taxation rate, so that kind of 80% tax on the highest earners in the post-war period, because they use that money. They obviously tax that from the very rich, and they would redistribute that from various means to other classes, and then you would basically have a fairer society. Okay, and that's what equality of outcome means. But by focusing on equality of outcome, it means a fairer society, not just better schools and stuff like that, but generally a more equal society. Okay, so who have we got who thinks about this? We've got two thinkers, really. We've got Beatrice Webb. Now, if you notice, she actually is born before, is right, Rosa Luxemburg, and lives a bit longer as well. So in A Constitution for the Socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, she argues there is an inevitability of gradualness of socialism realised through democratic reforms and parliamentary institutions. So what she argues essentially is that slowly capitalism would not only reform itself, and there's another guy who argues this as well. What's his name? Oh, Edward Bernstein. Okay, so he also argues that capitalism would reform and that people would become shareholders, and it would wealth would not just be concentrated in a few capitalists, but many. Beatrice Webb comes in and she argues that actually, as more and more workers are allowed to vote, you're going to get more and more socialist reforms and more workers in parliament, and they will fight for workers' interests, and gradually you will get change that way. Okay, so not via revolution, but in other ways. Okay. She also argued that the expansion of the state and technical expertise will deliver socialism. So she says, as the economy modernizes, you'll get these technocratic managers, and they will deliver socialism in the way as directed by Parliament and stuff like that. Okay, so how do we use her? So she, if you notice, most of her life, and she ends her life before this period of post-war consensus. So actually, she's arguing a little bit theoretically in a way, but she's a good thinker. She's a really good thinker to use on the route to socialism, and she's in direct conflict with Luxemburg in particular. Okay, and Marx as well, in that she thinks you can gradually reach socialism. She doesn't think we need a bloody revolution, etc., etc. You can also use in questions on the role of the state. She was a big fan on using the state and the economy. She thought that you could deliver socialism just through technical means. Okay, so by basically the state getting involved in people's lives and stuff would deliver socialism, and she advocated state and central planning to a large extent. Okay, so she was actually criticised later because she thought that Lenin's centrally planned economy was brilliant, and that's the way that Britain should go. Obviously, she died before we saw, the worst of that regime, but she actually thought that was probably the way to go. So, ironically, she probably actually wanted a lot more equality than maybe other social democrats, because she almost thinks that capitalism will disappear, but through natural means. But obviously, there's going to be a long time where the economy is mixed, etc., etc. Okay, Anthony Crosland is the big thinker, maybe, particularly because he is a thinker across the post-war consensus. In fact, he died, if you look at just at the end of his life, he dies before he really sees the post-war consensus crumble and Thatcher start. So, okay, so in The Future of Socialism, he argues that the inherent contradictions of capitalism were not as Marx predicted and could be overcome. So he basically says that actually capitalism was adaptive, and that actually it was bringing wealth to many people, not just a few. He advocated state-managed capitalism led by professional managers. So again, he's a good thinker for the state intervention. He argued that a socialist mixed economy was more efficient, fairer, and this is quite an interesting point he has. It's fairer as even talent was not earned. So he says, so he's coming from this standpoint that he says even actually, look, if you're born and I'm really smart and you're not so smart, then that's not fair. As I didn't earn that. It's just the way I am. So he says that actually, we should aim for fairness based on just the fact that we are all human. Okay, so he argued that a socialist economy led to more communitarian society, and equality of opportunity was not enough. So a communitarian society was that we all work together, we all, we are generally cooperate and stuff like that. So he argued that yes, we had to focus on equality of outcome too. Okay, so how to use? He's probably the most important thinker for social democrats, or the biggest one maybe, because of when he lived and what he said. The most important thinker for social democrats and the mixed economy. He argues why Marx was wrong, and why capitalism, but also why capitalism should be significantly tamed in order to ensure social justice, and why equality of outcome is important. Okay, so his ideas basically backed up this post-war. Okay, so now we have the third way, and we can see in pictorial form there is Tony Blair, and he's sat between Thatcher and Karl Marx. Okay, so what do they believe? Well, first off, where does it come from? What's the context? Okay, so even social democrats, their heyday, if you think, was after the Second World War, when people had worked together to defeat the Germans, and there was very much a communitarian, we're all in it together kind of spirit. And so that's where this big people argue anyway that this comes from. Where does the third way come from? Well, it sort of arises after the fall of communism and the rise in acceptance of neoliberalism. Okay, so what's happened is communism has fallen; it's discredited. So revolutionary socialism is internationally discredited. Thatcher and Reagan have risen through the 80s and shown that actually great wealth can be created with these policies which people wouldn't have dreamed of before, which these kind of monetarism and neoliberal kind of policies. So how does socialism respond? It sort of responds with a third way. Okay, it accepted the primacy of the market, and it introduced competitive practice into public services. So think about how our school runs. It's competitive, so we compete on results and we go into league tables. But Blair even put this into other services. So he does league tables for hospitals, he does league tables for police forces, he does all of this stuff. So he starts to believe in competition. The role of the state is more limited, but still expected to provide equality of welfare and equality of opportunity. So remember, equality of welfare is a minimum standard of living for people. That may be housing, that may be health, that may be, welfare, and equality of opportunity, that is to ensure fairness, social justice, but through the point of where you start in life. Okay, and an inherent, let me get rid of that a sec. So an inherent is this idea that actually inequality is okay in terms of your talents and your work and stuff like that, but we do want to ensure equality of opportunity. Okay, last thing, so the state is involved in social investment in education and competitive skills, but other than that, state intervention is kind of limited. Okay. Okay, so think Anthony Giddens still going. In the third way, so you can see how important he was. He literally calls it the third way. He rejects market intervention as as inefficient and wants to accept the free market. Sorry about the typo there, but let's press on. However, state has responsibility to ensure equality of opportunity. He argues for the social investment state that I just outlined on the last slide. So basically all of these ideas are his ideas. Okay. He also argued for more emphasis on community responsibility and social cohesion. So it was actually the Blair government that introduced ASBOs and this idea of community behaviour orders and stuff like that. Okay, how are you going to use him? Well, he was Blair's favourite academic, and as you can see from the title of the book, he is essentially the intellectual architect of the third way. He also talks a lot about personal responsibility, which, if you think about it, is a kind of right-wing idea. It's a bit more of a right-wing idea, but he expands it and comes up with the idea of like community responsibility, and sort of its inverse of like, he's worried not just about poverty, but about like what we call social exclusion and things like that. But essentially, if it's the third way, Anthony Giddens probably said it. Okay, so when you're talking about any aspect of the third way, you're probably going to talk about Giddens. Okay, so let's look at one essay, Socialism and the State, just to get an idea how you answer a question on socialism. Okay, so this is a bit of a tricky one. Not sure if they'll ask you this or not, but mainly because there's not so much area of agreement. So if you've got a question like, how far do socialists agree on the state? You might answer it something like this. So they agree that all support some state intervention of some form. Okay, they argue that the state should serve the people and advance equality in some sense. Okay, so that you could say advance equality, you could say they advance social justice in one sense, but it does depend on what their definition is. Okay, so how do they disagree? Well, let's start with the revolutionary socialists. They argue that capitalist state must be smashed, and they're alone in thinking this. Secondly, Marx actually predicted that the state would not be necessary under communist society. No other socialists think this. And however, in the Russian state, the state was responsible for literally everything. So it was centrally planned. There was Everything was planned and done by the state. Okay, how would social democrats disagree? Well, the state must be large enough, and intervene in the economy through taxation and redistribution to ensure equality of outcome, but they would allow some capitalism to continue. The state should run parts of the economy because it was more efficient. However, not all of it, not like a kind of revolutionary state. And that is obviously in conflict to the third way, which wouldn't have the state running actual businesses. The third way would argue that the state should be limited, providing for equality of opportunity and welfare only, and then it has a responsibility as a social investment state. So your essay would look something like that. Okay. Okay, last one. Last sort of afterthought. So this is, when I do these afterthoughts, this is maybe what your conclusion must look like, may look like. Okay, so I think that socialism that can be a very divided. I mean, if you look at the Labour Party, for instance, at the moment, you know, it can be a very divided branch or ideology. In particular, I think many socialists bitterly criticise Tony Blair as the third way, as not being properly socialist. However, what all the branches do have in common is a concept of social justice, and actually everyone who calls themselves a socialist, whether you like them or whether you don't like them, does have this in their core. They want some sort of idea of sort of fairness, and they completely disagree on how that's achieved. They completely disagree on how what that means, but that is the thing that sort of all ties them all together. Okay, okay. Good luck. Last video.